Hi there, Dr. Avinash here. Let's talk about chapter number 14, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or as they are lovingly written down as NSAIDs, and antipyretic analgesic. These are medications that have analgesic, antipyretic, and anti-inflammatory actions in different measures. They do not depress CNS like morphine. They do not produce physical dependence like morphine. They have zero abuse potential as compared to morphine, and they are more effective or particularly effective in inflammatory pain. And that's why they are also called as non-narcotic, non-opioid or aspirin-like analgesics. Important. Remember that. Their primary action is on the peripheral pain mechanism, but they can also increase the CNS threshold to pain. These are over-the-counter preparation or non-prescription drugs. You just walk in and get a medication. You need to know this classification properly. Very, very important. All of them. But actually speaking, you need to know aspirin properly and acetaminophen or paracetamol perfectly. Other ones are more important from your MCQ perspective, or they would be really odd answer which nobody would have prepared, so you don't have to worry. But I will give you some salient features of let's say diclofenac, aceclofenac. We'll try to complete that in this video, and maybe a little bit of ibuprofen and indomethacin. Let's see how much we can do. The mechanism of action is very, very simple. Whenever there is inflammation, there is prostaglandin synthesis. Prostaglandins, prostacyclins, and thromboxane A2, they are all produced from the same acid, arachidonic acid, by the enzyme cyclooxygenase. Cyclooxygenase exists in two forms, COX1 and COX2. COX1 cyclooxygenase is a constitutive enzyme, which means it is present and working inside the cell throughout the lifespan of a cell. It just works. Inducible is when there is an enzyme, but normally it is not working. It will be working whenever need arises. So you can think of the first one, the constitutive one, as the physiological housekeeping function. COX2 is in very little quantity and will be made when it is induced by cytokines or other signal molecules at the site of inflammation. So whenever there is inflammation, prostaglandins are made locally. The important thing that you have to know is it's not like only at the site of inflammation COX2 works. COX2 is also present at some other sites in the brain, in the juxtaglomerular cells, and even in the fetus. So here it might have some physiological roles too. Most of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that I'm going to discuss are going to inhibit COX1 and COX2 non-selectively. But now we have selective COX2 inhibitors which will block only the inducible one, not the constitutive one. Okay. Now they have given this beautiful table. You need to know this table. Okay. Because sometimes they ask in our exams the difference between non-selective COX inhibitors and selective COX2 inhibitors. So you need to know what happens where. Please do this table properly. Now we are going to talk about aspirin a lot. Aspirin inhibits COX irreversibly by acetylating its serine residue. Okay, so if you want the cell to start making COX, have a functional COX, you need to make a new enzyme. Other non-steroidal drugs are competitive reversible inhibitors, which means the COX returns to activity as soon as the level of the drug in the plasma decreases. The drug dissociates from the enzyme. Simple. All non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs produce analgesia. Prostaglandins cause hyperalgesia, which means extra pain, by changing the property of free nerve endings. So stimuli that normally does not cause pain will also cause pain. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs do not affect the tenderness, okay, which might be induced by direct application of prostaglandins. But the pain sensitizing mechanism, which is induced by bradykinin, TNF-alpha, interleukins, and all the other pain producing substances, analgesic substances, are blocked. How non-steroidal anti-inflammatories inhibit COX-2. This is the most important peripheral action. So any inflammation associated pain, these non-steroidal drugs are very, very effective. Now we also have realized that there is a central component to the analgesic action, where inhibition of prostaglandin synthesis in the spinal cord, dorsal horn neurons, as well as in the brain are, this production is inhibited of prostaglandins. Now, if you inhibit the prostaglandin synthesis in the dorsal horn neurons as well as in the brain, so what big deal? At these places, prostaglandins was amplifying the pain impulses. That amplification will now not occur. That's the plan. So there is some central action also. Non-steroidal drugs also lower body temperature, but don't cause hypothermia. Okay, so it's not like if there is fever and you take paracetamol, temperature decreases. You don't have fever, you take paracetamol, you won't become cold. This is because the fever during infection and tissue injury is by generation of pyrogens called as interleukins, TNF alphas, interferons. These reach the hypothalamus, and there prostaglandin E2 synthesis is induced because of these chemicals. And when hypothalamus has PGE2, it raises the temperature set point, and that's how fever happens. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatories block the action of pyrogen. PGE2 is not produced. That's why temperature set point comes back to normal. Now, if you inject PGE2 into hypothalamus, there will be fever. Get this correct. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs do not block prostaglandins. They stop the synthesis of prostaglandin. Now, the isoform dominant at this site is COX-2, but COX-1 can also be there. Also remember, fever can happen by other mechanisms also. So not always you will get 100% relief of fever by these medications. The most important mechanism of anti-inflammatory action is inhibition of COX-2. Now, COX-2 actually enhances prostaglandin synthesis at the site of injury. So when you inhibit COX-2, you inhibit the prostaglandin synthesis also. Okay. Maybe constitutive COX-1 also contributes to suppression of inflammation, at least in the initial stages. Different drugs will have different potency. Nimesulide is actually a drug that has potent anti-inflammatory and relatively weak COX inhibitor. So we don't know how this works. And prostaglandins are the only one of the many mediators. So if you only block COX, you are blocking prostaglandins, but there are leukotrienes, platelet activating factors, cytokines. So all these things will not be depressed. Simple. And inflammation is a result of participation of a large number of vasoactive, chemotactic, proliferative factors at different stages. So anti-inflammatory actions can happen at many stages, but never 100% suppression will happen, again because there are many other chemicals involved. Simple. Now, during acute inflammation, activated endothelial cells make some adhesion molecules which direct the WBCs to come to the site of inflammation. Inflammatory cells also express selectins and integrins. So inflammatory cells, which means neutrophils and macrophages, they have selectins and integrins. The endothelial cells have ECAM, this is not ELAM, ECAM and ICAM, and these are cell adhesion molecules. This and this combines, the WBC stops and comes out into the tissue. It is suggested that NSAIDs might be acting on these molecules. So maybe it's not expressed properly, or maybe the generation of superoxide, other free radicals is interfered with. Okay, even growth factors like GM-CSF, interleukin 6, lymphocyte transformation factor, TNF alpha, they might be affected. Even lysosomes become stabilized. The lysosomes don't break, they don't come out. And antagonism of kinins. All these probably adds to the anti-inflammatory action. Even though we say they are going to block COX, there are additional actions also. Some women when they have their menses, it's extremely painful. It's called as dysmenorrhea. It is clearly demonstrated that prostaglandins cause dysmenorrhea. How do we know this? The level of prostaglandins in the menstrual blood flow is high. It's high in the endometrial biopsy. PGF2 alpha metabolite in the circulation is raised in all these women who have dysmenoric symptoms. Intermittent ischemia of the myometrium is also responsible for the muscle cramps. When you give NSAIDs to these women, you are reducing the prostaglandin levels. 60 to 70% females will tell absolute 100% relief they have got. Others will say pain has decreased substantially. Automatically, other symptoms such as headache, muscle pains, and nausea are relieved. Excess flow can be normalized. For platelets to aggregate, they have thromboxane A2. But in you and me, platelets don't aggregate normally, right? So they have anti-aggregatory PGI2 also. Clear? Now, when you give non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they inhibit both pro-aggregatory and anti-aggregatory prostanoids. Prostanoids are compounds, these thromboxanes and interleukins, and so not interleukin, prostaglandins and prostacyclins, they are prostanoids. They affect the COX-1 generated thromboxane A2 more. Now, if pro-aggregatory thromboxane A2 is not going to work, then the anti-aggregatory will work, which means there will be inhibition of platelet aggregation, prolonged bleeding time. Aspirin is highly active because once it goes inside the platelets, it acetylates the COX enzyme irreversibly even before it reaches the portal circulation. So even before it reaches the liver, I'm so sorry for that. So in the portal circulation, before getting deacetylated in the liver, aspirin has done its job of hitting platelets. So even small dose of aspirin can have a fantastic antithrombotic effect. And how long does the platelets last? Around 7 days, 5 to 7 days. Remember, platelets are not really cells, they are cell fragments. The original cell was megakaryocyte. Platelets do not have the capacity to regenerate any enzyme. Once the aspirin has inhibited COX-1, it is permanent. The platelet becomes useless. The only problem is for these 5 to 7 days, the risk of surgical bleeding and anticoagulant associated bleeding increases drastically because the platelets will not clot. Another function is ductus arteriosus closure. See, during fetal circulation, there is this connection between the pulmonary trunk and arch of aorta, which was called as ductus arteriosus. Why is that ductus arteriosus open in a baby inside the womb? Why not in us? Because when the baby is in the fetal stage inside the womb, it makes prostaglandin E2 at the ductus arteriosus level, and this keeps the ductus open. Now, by some mechanism, we don't know how, when the child is born, this production of PGE2 stops and the ductus arteriosus closes and becomes ligamentum arteriosum. If this mechanism fails to occur, you can give indomethacin or aspirin. Automatically, there will be closure of ductus arteriosus within few hours. Okay. Now, don't give NSAIDs in the late pregnancy because then there might be premature closure of ductus. This has known to happen, so be very, very careful. Plus, because of the antiplatelet action, the risk of postpartum hemorrhage will increase. So, never give this medication near term. The reason why baby is delivered is because of sudden spurt of prostaglandin synthesis in the uterus. This happens a few hours maybe before the labor starts. So this is thought to be the trigger that facilitates the progression of labor. So logically speaking, if you give non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, there is a potential to delay and retard labor. But then again, even if prostaglandins are not there, labor does proceed. So these are not like the foolproof methods. Now let's talk about some damage these NSAIDs can do. Gastric mucosal damage can happen. Gastric pain, mucosa getting eroded, ulcerations can happen, blood loss can happen. All these things can happen. Relative gastric toxicity is a major concern for all non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and we need to choose our medicine properly. If you inhibit COX-1, then the gastroprotective in the stomach has to be protected from the acid, right? So that acid, who is protecting the stomach from the acid? Mucus. So prostaglandins, which reduce the level of acid in the stomach and increase the level of mucus. If you inhibit that COX-1, this gastroprotective PGs will not be formed, right? Normally what they do, they block hydrogen ion. Here, because of blockade, there will be back diffusion of hydrogen. Hydrogen will come back towards the cells and destroy the cells. Deficiency of prostaglandin will reduce the mucus and the bicarbonate secretion, enhances acid secretion, and that also causes damage to the epithelium. Prostaglandin deficiency may promote to mucosal ischemia. So basically NSAIDs enhance the destructive, the aggressive factors and limit the defensive factors in gastric mucosa. So theoretically they are ulcerogenic, they can cause ulcers. Now compared to this, paracetamol is a very weak inhibitor of COX. So it does not cause much problem, and even COX-2 inhibitors are safer. We are worried about the COX-1 inhibitors, okay? Similarly, there will be hypovolemia, decreased renal perfusion, and Na plus loss induced prostaglandin PG synthesis, which brings about the adjustment. They are all gone. How are the adjustment done? By promoting vasodilatation, by stopping the reabsorption of chloride, opposing the action of ADH. All this goes. Simple. So, 3 mechanisms have been proposed by which non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs will have renal effect. First, the COX-1 dependent impairment of renal blood flow and reduction of GFR. If the kidney is already a little insufficient in functioning and you block COX-1, the renal blood flow becomes even more impaired. Condition can worsen. Juxtaglomerular COX-2 inhibition. If it is inhibited, juxtaglomerular COX-2, sodium and water retention is inhibited, and ability to cause papillary necrosis by habitual intake by itself is a problem. Okay, now please understand, you and me, normal individuals who take one-off tablet of paracetamol, crocin, or aspirin, nothing is going to happen. But if somebody has congestive heart failure, hypovolemia, hepatic cirrhosis, renal disease, or patients who are receiving diuretics and antihypertensives, in them sodium retention and edema definitely can happen. Diuretics and antihypertensive effect will be lost. Okay, remember this please. Now moving on to anaphylactoid reaction. Aspirin can precipitate asthma, angioneurotic swellings, urticaria or rhinitis in susceptible individuals only, not in all. Okay. These subjects actually react similarly to different NSAIDs. These are chemically diverse, so probably not an immunological reaction per se. Maybe inhibition of COX with some arachidonic acid going towards leukotriene synthesis, some other pathway is involved. There is no proof for this, we're just guessing. Now what I just spoke about is important, very important. This is what are the beneficial actions that I spoke, and these are the toxicities that I spoke. So instead of reading this entire thing, when you are revising, read this entire thing please. When you are revising, please use these 2 tables to help you revise faster. Simple. The first drug we are going to do from this chapter is salicylate, called as aspirin. Chemically it is acetyl salicylic acid. The moment it goes into the body, it is converted into salicylic acid. This is the main reason for the action, salicylic acid. The actions are because of acetylation of certain macromolecule including COX. So we give acetyl salicylic acid, liver converts it into salicylic acid, and that salicylic acid acetylates other macromolecules. Simple. This is one of the oldest, most famous analgesic anti-inflammatory drug and has tremendous use. Now, do you even have to read in details the pharmacological action? Of course, no, you know it. It's analgesic, antipyretic, anti-inflammatory. Remember the dose. I think this is the first time in the entire pharmacology I am telling you to remember the dose. Aspirin is a weaker analgesic as compared to morphine, but it effectively relieves inflammatory, tissue injury related, connective tissue and integumental pain. It's not effective in visceral and ischemic pain, no, not that one. But the inflammation related, injury related pain works pretty good. How does it work? By obtending the peripheral pain receptors and preventing prostaglandin mediated sensitization of nerve ending. We also spoke about the central subcortical action. Subcortical is at the level of spinal cord, raising the threshold of pain perception, and it also contributes to analgesia, but it does not have that morphine like psychic processing. No action on the morphine like psychic processing. That is missing. Okay. No sedation, no other subjective effect, no tolerance, no dependence is produced. Aspirin is anti-fever. It is antipyretic because it resets the hypothalamic thermostats. The moment this happens, fever is reduced by promoting heat loss by sweating and cutaneous vasodilatation. It does not decrease heat production, it only enhances heat loss by resetting the hypothalamic thermostat. It is anti-inflammatory. For that you require higher doses, 3 to 6 gram per day. All signs of inflammation are suppressed, including WBC infiltration. Okay, maybe it not only inhibits COX, it quenches the free radical. It removes the free radical from the body at the site of inflammation, which is probably one of the reasons why it is such a good anti-inflammatory. Okay. It does not stop the disease, it only stops the inflammation. So if you give for rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, the disease will continue, the rheumatic fever will continue. This is more like a symptomatic thing. GIT, well, irritates the gastric mucosa, so that will cause epigastric pain, nausea, vomiting. At high doses can even stimulate chemoreceptor trigger zone. Remember, vomiting can happen because of the central action. Now this is very important that you have to understand. Aspirin has a pKa, dissociation constant, of 3.5, which means at pH 3.5 it will be 50% unionized, 50% ionized. In the gastric juice, aspirin remains non-ionized because acid in the stomach is at the pH of around 2. So here it's near, right? 3.5 and 2 is like nearby. So it remains unionized, and because of it being unionized, it can cross the cell membrane. So it crosses the cell membrane and enters the mucosal cell. The problem is the mucosal cell has the pH of 7.1. Now this gap is too much, 3.5 and 7.1. Here it immediately ionizes, and now unionized molecules cross the cell membrane. Ionized molecules do not cross the cell membrane. Ionized aspirin gets trapped, and as a result the gastric mucosal cell gets even more damaged because it's getting trapped. Aspirin is getting trapped in that cell. Okay. Apart from this, when aspirin particles come in contact with the gastric mucosa, local back diffusion of acid takes place. So the acid also goes back into the cell, and this causes focal necrosis of the mucosal cells and the capillaries, and it causes acute ulcers, erosive gastritis, congestion, and at least microscopic hemorrhage, if not frank hemorrhage. How do you know this? If you check the stool sample, you will find occult blood loss. Occult blood loss means hidden blood loss. It's not frank, you can't see it very easily. The blood loss averages 5 ml per day at the anti-inflammatory doses. So that's quite a significant blood loss, and rarely even hematemesis may happen. Okay. Now many times you give Disprin with this dispersible aspirin tablet. It contains calcium carbonate and citric acid also, and other buffered preparations. They change the pH of the stomach. This ion trapping does not take place, so they are less liable to cause gastric irritation. But it's not like a big difference between people taking Disprin and aspirin. Both get similar, almost similar amount of ulcers. Aspirin, even in small doses, remember, irreversibly inhibits thromboxane A2 synthesis by platelets, which interferes with the platelet aggregation, and the bleeding time will be prolonged to twice the normal value, and this will last for almost a week because that is the lifespan of platelets. If you take this long term, there will be decrease in the synthesis of clotting factor also. That can also lead to bleeding. So give prophylactic vitamin K therapy. There are some metabolic and other effects of high anti-inflammatory doses or toxic doses. Analgesic dose of aspirin for fever, headache, it has no other action. It only does that, and that's the end. The high doses, 3 to 6 grams per day, that which is needed for anti-inflammatory action, like in rheumatoid arthritis, rheumatic fever, that creates many other effects. This includes: 1. Cellular metabolism is enhanced, especially in skeletal muscle. This is because of uncoupling of oxidative phosphorylation. Electron transport chain works, ATP is not produced. ATP is not produced, muscles need ATP. What will they do? They'll start breaking glucose more, and as a result there will be a fall in blood glucose level, especially in diabetic. Eventually the liver glycogen will get depleted. But in toxic doses, central sympathetic stimulation happens and rise in blood sugar happens. This is an MCQ. So at anti-inflammatory dose something else happens, and at high dose something else happens. Respiration is stimulated by direct action on the respiratory center, plus increased carbon dioxide production. Remember, there is this uncoupling. Carbon dioxide is made, ATPs are not made. This causes hyperventilation. And then at toxic doses, respiratory depression can also happen. Now, this is a big problem. When you breathe in, breathe out faster, carbon dioxide is washed out earlier. Carbon dioxide theoretically is an acid. CO2 gives reacts with H2O to give you H2CO3. So CO2 is an acid. If you throw away carbon dioxide, acid is gone. That causes respiratory alkalosis. You know what happens then? Kidneys say there is too much of alkali, let me throw away bicarbonate. And this stage is called as compensated respiratory alkalosis. Most adults who are receiving this 3 to 5 gram dose per day are in this state already. If you give higher doses, then excess carbon dioxide production happens, respiration gets depressed, and it leads to respiratory acidosis. The muscles start making metabolic acids, lactic acid, pyruvic acid, acetoacetic acid. Even the medicine is acetyl salicylic acid. It adds to this metabolic acidosis now. So what was respiratory became metabolic. The plasma HCO3 minus is already low because in this stage the kidney threw it away, right now. Correct? Over time dehydration will happen because of excess loss in urine, sweating, hyperventilation. This is the phase during salicylic poisoning which most children present with. In adults this is kind of a late phenomena. Simple. Now aspirin does not have any direct action on the heart or circulation, but at dose which will change that metabolic rate, even the cardiac activity has to increase, right? The cardiac output has to increase. So it's an indirect increase in the cardiac output. At toxic doses, the vasomotor center gets depressed. So BP falls, and if a patient has low cardiac reserve, then the congestive cardiac failure might be precipitated. And the last important effect, adverse effect, let's say metabolic effect of aspirin is the fact that it interferes with urate excretion and antagonizes the uricosuric effect of probenecid. Probenecid is medicine given in cases of gout. It helps in excretion of uric acid. Aspirin interferes with that. At high doses, it can block urate reabsorption, increase in excretion. But again, it's not a reliable uricosuric. You can't give it in patients of gout and expect aspirin to help throw uric acid. No, that's not going to happen. We are not interested in the pharmacokinetics. It's really not important. As far as the adverse effects go, you already know most of it. You must know this. At the analgesic dose, nausea, vomiting, epigastric distress, and increased occult blood loss. We have seen this, right? Now it's just a repetition of whatever we have seen. And this is because of gastric mucosal damage and peptic ulceration. This is the most important adverse effect, right? We spoke about hypersensitivity and idiosyncrasy, which is very infrequent, but it can present to us with rash, fixed drug eruptions, urticaria, rhinorrhea, angioedema, asthma, even anaphylactic reaction. So that can happen. At anti-inflammatory doses, you get a condition called as salicylism. Now, instead of asking you what is the toxicity of aspirin at anti-inflammatory dose, they can actually ask you salicylism. Be aware that salicylism is excess dosage of aspirin, dizziness, tinnitus, vertigo, reversible impairment of hearing and vision, excitement and hyperventilation, and sometimes electrolyte imbalance. Okay, so this is salicylism. Aspirin therapy in children with rheumatoid arthritis can raise serum transaminase level, which tells us that there is some kind of liver damage. Most cases are asymptomatic but can be potentially dangerous, right? And then we have seen a condition between salicylate therapy and Reye syndrome. It's hepatic encephalopathy in children having viral infections. So never give aspirin to a child who is having viral infection. It's not like only the children will have liver damage. Any adult who has long-term therapy with high-dose aspirin, they will also get hepatic injury. We have also spoken about salt and water retention at higher doses, right? You can write that. Now, some people leave their medicines easily accessible to children, which is not a good thing. If a child eats good amount of aspirin, the child will end up with acute salicylate poisoning. In adults, it's kind of rare, but if somebody has to die because of taking aspirin, they have to take 15 to 30 grams. In children, it's much lower. Now, remember the side effects that we just spoke about and repeat them. Vomiting, dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, acidotic breathing, hyper or hypoglycemia, the metabolic effects, hemorrhage, restlessness, delirium, hallucinations, hyperpyrexia, convulsions, coma, and death due to respiratory and cardiovascular collapse. The treatment is very symptomatic and supportive. Give external cooling, give IV fluids with sodium, potassium, bicarbonate, and glucose according to the need. You keep monitoring the baby and keep on giving supportive care. And if necessary, blood transfusion and vitamin K can also be added to your treatment protocol. Simple. Best case scenario, aspirin comes as an LAQ, you write this much, you get almost full marks. Okay? But this is important. Please remember all the doses also, wherever we have done. Okay, precautions and contraindications are kind of optional. If you want to do it, that would be good. Interactions are not really important. Now, once you have done this much, the uses become like a byproduct. You know, as analgesic, for pain such as headache, backache, myalgia, joint pain, pulled muscle, toothache, neuralgias, dysmenorrhea, right? A single dose of 1000 mg is much more effective than low dose 0.3, 0.6 mg 6 to 8 hours. A single dose works fantastic. It's an antipyretic. Fever of any origin. Dose is same as that in analgesia, but paracetamol is safer, so we prefer that. In case of acute rheumatic fever, aspirin is the first drug to be used in all cases. If it fails, then you add others like corticosteroid and all. Otherwise, don't. In a dose of 4 to 5 grams in divided portion per day, that much you give, marked symptomatic relief in just 1 to 3 days. After 4 to 7 days, you decrease the dose of aspirin and start at 50 mg per kg per day. Continue this for 2 to 3 weeks or till the signs of active disease like raised ESR is there. Once the ESR becomes normal, stop the drug gradually over the next 2 weeks. Simple. Once the lesions start, they are not affected. They are not altered. Okay. In rheumatoid arthritis, aspirin in the dose of 3 to 5 gram per day will give relief from pain, swelling and morning stiffness, but the disease process is not affected. For a long period of time, giving so much of aspirin is not good, and hence we use newer non-steroidal drugs. Osteoarthritis, again symptomatic relief. We don't use this now. Paracetamol would be our first choice drug because no side effects or very little side effects. Post myocardial infarction, post stroke patients, you want the clot to not form. By inhibiting platelet aggregation, the chances of reinfarction in the brain, in the heart, decreases drastically. Remember, thromboxane A2 synthesis is blocked even at low doses. Okay, so given low doses. If you give in high doses, chances are the high dose will give away all the beneficial effects because it will also inhibit prostacyclin. So low dose is the way to go forward. Aspirin 75 to 150 mg per day reduces the chance of reinfarction. So it is routinely prescribed. Okay, especially the new onset or sudden worsening angina, give it. You can give 100 to 150 mg aspirin per day for 12 weeks. The chance that the patient will end up with heart attack will decrease by 50%. Okay, even with stroke does not happen directly. Many people have warnings called as transient ischemic attack, stroke for 24 hours. You give aspirin, the chances of TIAs, transient ischemic attacks, decrease. Incidence of stroke decreases. Simple. We can even use it for preventing preeclampsia. It is suggested that pregnancy-related hypertension and preeclampsia is because of imbalance between thromboxane A2 and prostacyclin. Aspirin 80 to 100 mg per day from 12th week of gestation till childbirth reduces the risk of preeclampsia. Give this to women who are susceptible, like diabetic, chronic kidney disease, some predisposing factor. Write this much and you are done. You don't have to do anything. I recommend you do ibuprofen. Overall, just give a look at it. Okay, this is kind of over-the-counter drug for most pains. Okay, so ibuprofen can be done. I do not really wish to explain any of these because it does not make too much sense. It's not going to come in your exam, so you can skip all of this. If you get time, maybe indomethacin, have a look, and if you have a doubt, please ask me. Otherwise, not important. Move ahead and go to maybe diclofenac sodium. It's just like naproxen, inhibits prostaglandins. Like once you know the basic format, everything is the same. The good thing is adverse effects of diclofenac are usually mild. Okay, so it's better. Diclofenac is most extensively used NSAID, used in rheumatoid and osteoarthritis, bursitis, ankylosing spondylitis, toothache, dysmenorrhea, renal colic, post-traumatic and post-operative inflammatory conditions. It's quick pain relief, even decreases wound edema. We love this drug. Okay, the common name for this is Voveran. You might have had it in your lifetime. Okay, and then there's aceclofenac, the newer variety of moderately COX-2 selective congener. I don't think they will ask you anything apart from this. Do this table please: selective COX-2 inhibitors, cardiovascular risk and other concern. Read it. It means just read it. You don't have to go in too much of details. Just know that people don't love COX-2 inhibitors too much. Okay, they have some issues. Which brings me to the second and The second most important answer of this chapter is paracetamol, also known as acetaminophen. There was an analgesic antipyretic, and people thought that using this caused kidney damage, and it did. That NSAID was phenacetin. It was good, but it was banned because of that analgesic abuse nephropathy. So what we did, we de-ethylated the active metabolite of phenacetin, that is paracetamol. Okay, this one has central actions like aspirin, like raises the pain threshold, but it does not act on the peripheral component, the blocking of the prostaglandins synthesis at periphery. That does not happen. If you give analgesic aspirin and paracetamol together, they are additive, so the action is even better. It's a good antipyretic. Please note, it has negligible anti-inflammatory action. In the peripheral tissue, just does not work on COX. It works only on the brain COX. Now, it is suggested that in presence of the peroxides at the site of inflammation, paracetamol cannot interact with the COX at the site of inflammation. But peroxides are not present in the brain, and hence paracetamol can act on the brain. It is also suggested that maybe it is inhibiting COX-3, which is the reason why there is analgesic antipyretic action, but we are not 100% sure of that. Paracetamol does not stimulate respiration, does not affect acid-base balance, does not increase cellular metabolism, does not have any effect on CNS, has very insignificant gastric irritation, like hardly any bleeding will happen. It does not have any effect on platelet function, no clotting factors are decreased, it's not uricosary. So whatever drawbacks of aspirin are there, this is not having any of those. Okay, well absorbed orally. You need to know the adverse effects. The way you and I probably take paracetamol is like, okay, once in a month, once in 5 months, once in a year, whenever we get like sick, headache is there, fever is there, then we take. How many tablets do we take? Like one or two tablets in a day, 2-3 days maybe, that's it. Nothing happens. With that dose, nothing happens. Rarely some nausea or rash, leukopenia, very rare. But again, these drugs can cause poisoning in small children. Now this is very important. Okay, the reason why small children are susceptible is because they have low hepatic glucuronide conjugating ability, the ability of your liver to conjugate paracetamol with glucuronide is less. If a large dose is taken, toxicities can happen, and at more than 250 mg per kg dose, fatality is common. The person, the child, the adult, whoever has taken the overdose, starts with just nausea, vomiting and abdominal pain. The liver becomes tender, but there is no problem with the consciousness. After 12 to 18 hours, the liver starts to die. This death of the liver is called as centrilobular hepatic necrosis. Simultaneously, the kidneys tubes also die. Renal tubular necrosis happens. The glucose level falls and that progresses to coma. Jaundice starts after 2 days. Now, if it is too much dose, then it will lead to fulminant hepatic failure and death. And if the levels are lower, supportive treatment is given, recovery will happen. The mechanism of toxicity is something like this. When paracetamol is being metabolized, it is primarily metabolized by conjugation with glutathione. Simple. So normally paracetamol is detoxified by conjugation with glutathione. But if the dose is more than what the liver can conjugate, then there is a highly reactive arylating minor metabolite of paracetamol that is formed. That metabolite is called as N-acetyl P-benzoquinone imine, NABQI, N-acetyl P-benzoquinone imine. Now, at say one tablet is taken. Oh, the liver has enough glutathione conjugation. It will do the job properly. 2 tablets are taken, 5 tablets are taken, 10 tablets are taken. The liver has enough glutathione, no problem whatsoever. Clear? But if many more 20, 30, 40 tablets have been taken, then the glutathione synthesis, the glutathione in the liver is insufficient. Then the liver does arylation. So that's arylating minor metabolite, NAPQI, is formed only when the glucuronide addition capacity is saturated. Okay, which happens when the hepatic glutathione is depleted, or something like that. Now this metabolite, the N-acetyl P-benzoquinolamine, binds covalently to the proteins of the liver and the kidney cells, causing necrosis of the cells. Okay, so only when glutathione is over, that is when the poisoning effects will manifest, otherwise no. Now please understand, there are people who take alcohol. These chronic alcoholics, if they take even 5 grams of this medication, they might end up with too much of NAPQI, and never give it to premature infants. They don't have capacity to metabolize this medicine. Simple enough. So how do you manage this case? How do you treat this case? If the patient is brought early, induce gastric lavage. Okay, induce vomiting or get gastric lavage done, and try to remove as much of unabsorbed paracetamol as possible. Then you give activated charcoal orally or through a nasogastric tube. Now what does this activated charcoal do? Activated charcoal stops further absorption. That's it. Other supportive measures should be taken, like support respiratory system, blood pressure, airway, breathing, circulation has to be maintained. That's it. Keep the patient admitted in the hospital. Now, important. There's a specific antidote available called as N-acetylcysteine. You actually read it in a chapter of respiratory system, where we spoke about anti-cough medication. N-acetylcysteine is mentioned there. If you use N-acetylcysteine 150 mg per kg infused IV in 200 ml of 5% glucose over 15 minutes, and then you repeat the same dose but now slowly over 20 hours, it should do the job. It replenishes the glutathione stores of the liver and prevents binding of this NAPQI to other cell constituents, and as a result the toxicity decreases. Some doctors recommend giving 75 mg per kg orally every 4 to 6 hours for 2 to 3 days. You can use any strategy. Okay. Now, please note, if the patient came to us very early, the better it is, because before that NAPQI is, formed, we can start this N-acetylcysteine and the patient will definitely be saved. But if the patient comes like almost 16 hours later or more, then all our treatment is just supportive. We are just praying that the patient survives. Okay. It's an over-the-counter medication. It's for pain. It's for, fever. That's it. So talk about all these: headache, mild migraine, musculoskeletal pain, dysmenorrhea. But when there is inflammation, it might not really work. So it's a first choice analgesia for osteoarthritis. Right? Best drug for fever, because in children it does not have any risk of Ray's syndrome. So great, right? This is it. This is what you need to do from this chapter. You can do some additional topics as I have marked for you in the main classification of drugs part, but the choice is completely yours. For your exam, this is what is necessary. I hope you have understood this. This is Dr. Avinash signing off for now. Take care, keep studying, keep rocking. I will see you in my next video. Bye.